was tuned in to Dylan, because Dylan's thing was like, don't ask me what it means, man. I wrote it. I don't know what it means. What do you think it means? He was just constantly going.
The intensity of Bob Dylan's attachment to Sara Lownds, the decades-long arc of their marriage, and the visceral intimacy of his 1975 song Sara are truly iconic. There are more twists and detours in this real-life relationship than in most Hollywood romance films. Documented real-life events, autobiographical lyricism, and the enduring mythic stature of their relationship anchor Sara as the defining figure in Dylan's private and creative world. This is the story of how Bob Dylan confessed that she was the love of his life. Let's get started. Meeting Sara Lownds and the end of the Biz era. Sara Lownds, born Shirley Marlin Nosniski, on October 28, 1939, began her life far from the music world she would eventually enter through Bob Dylan. She grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, the daughter of Isaac and Bessie Nosniski, and moved to New York City as a young adult, seeking work and independence. Before encountering Dylan, she first married a commercial photographer named Hans Lownds in 1959, adopting his surname and stepping into the world of Manhattan's magazine and advertising photography. During this period, she modeled for publications such as Harper's Bazaar, appearing in fashion spreads and editorial layouts, and later worked as a secretary at Time Life's film production division. The marriage to Hans Lownds lasted only a few years. By the early 1960s, the relationship had deteriorated, and Sara had separated from him. She was raising her young daughter, Maria, and navigating the city as a single mother while working in an industry that exposed her to a circle of artists, photographers, musicians, and filmmakers. Bob Dylan entered New York City in January 1961. Here, he established himself as a rising figure in the Greenwich Village folk scene almost immediately. His performances at Gerde's Folk City, the Gaslight Cafe, and the Folklore Center attracted attention for their intensity and distinctive songwriting. In April 1961, he met Joan Baez, then one of the most prominent young voices in American folk music. Baez had already released her debut album in 1960, which reached the top 10 on the Billboard charts, and she was selling out major concert halls. Their duet performances, including appearances at the 1963 and 1964 Newport Folk Festivals, helped amplify Dylan's visibility. By late 1962 or early 1963, their relationship had shifted from professional to romantic, though they never provided a detailed public timeline. As Dylan's fame accelerated with the release of The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan in 1963 and The Times They Are A-Changin' in 1964, the Baez-Dylan partnership became one of the most watched artistic pairings of the decade. Baez, deeply associated with political activism and the civil rights movement, used her concerts to highlight Dylan's songs and encouraged his participation in the social justice causes she championed. Their appearance together at the March on Washington in August 1963 placed them at the center of a major historical moment. But as Dylan's artistic direction changed in 1964 and 1965, moving away from traditional folk toward more personal, surrealistic, and eventually electric sounds, tensions appeared between them. Baez's own recollections indicate that his increasing independence, the demands of his touring schedule, and his evolving image created emotional distance. By the time of Dylan's 1965 tour of the United Kingdom, documented in D.A. Pennebaker's film Don't Look Back, the strain between them was evident. Baez accompanied him to England, intending to perform with him, but he rarely invited her on stage. While all of this was unfolding publicly, Dylan's private life was shifting in a different direction. Dylan's first meeting with Sara Lownds happened in 1964, most likely through Sally Grossman, the wife of his manager, Albert Grossman. Sally and her husband were deeply embedded in the New York and Woodstock arts communities, and their home was a gathering point. Musicians and friends often chimed in and mingled here. Sara, separated from Hans Lownds and working at Time Life, moved in similar circles. Their connection formed quietly and quickly. By early 1965, Dylan's relationship with Baez had unraveled to the point where they were effectively no longer a couple, even if the public had not yet fully realized it. At the same time, Dylan's bond with Sara deepened. She was present during parts of his 1965 recording sessions, including the period surrounding the creation of Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited, though she was not a visible presence in his professional life. In July 1965, Dylan performed his controversial electric set at the Newport Folk Festival, a turning point in his artistic identity. By this stage, he was living a largely separate emotional life from Baez, despite still appearing with her occasionally. Meanwhile, Sara's life was undergoing changes of its own. Having left her first marriage, she was raising her daughter, Maria, and working steadily. Her relationship with Dylan unfolded privately, and by mid-1965, she was pregnant. At this point, Dylan was at the height of public scrutiny, touring internationally, confronting controversy over his electric music, rapidly producing some of the most important albums of his career. Yet, his private life moved in the opposite direction, inward, domestic, and away from the crowds. On November 22, 1965, in a small, unpublicized ceremony in New York City, Bob Dylan married Sara Lownds. Only a few people attended. Within weeks, the news reached the press, surprising even some of Dylan's close collaborators. Early in 1966, their son Jesse was born, and Dylan later adopted Maria, Sara's daughter, from her previous marriage. Baez began to speak openly in later years about their breakup, describing it as painful but ultimately rooted in the natural divergence of their lives. She continued to perform his songs, record tributes, and reflect on his influence long after their romance ended. How marriage transformed Dylan's life. Over the following years, the family grew. Their children, Anna Dylan, born on July 11, 1967, Samuel Dylan, born on July 30, 1968, and Jacob Dylan, born on December 9, 1969, completed the household. With marriage and children came a marked change in Dylan's lifestyle. Whereas the early 1960s had seen him immersed in relentless touring and public performance, the mid to late 1960s ushered in a period of retreat, domesticity, and relative privacy. The family settled in Woodstock, New York, a retreat from city life and media scrutiny, giving Dylan and Sara space to raise their children away from the constant spotlight. Biographies and contemporaries describe Sara as a stabilizing and grounding presence during this period. Known for her Romany spirit and a sharp intelligence coupled with calm resolve, she was someone Dylan's friends regarded as wise beyond her years, attuned to folklore and traditional wisdom. Others noted her as a good listener, resourceful, and quietly confident. According to some acquaintances, Sara helped Dylan step back from the frenetic pace of fame, offering him a safe harbor. Routine, domestic chores, daily rhythms far removed from touring, noise, and expectation. The shift in Dylan's life was not only private, but creative. After the domestic move, during the period known to many as the Woodstock years, Dylan grew quieter, less public, and seemed to channel much of his energy into family life, writing, painting, and informal musical sessions rather than frantic touring. The sessions recorded with his collaborators, later known as the Basement Tapes, came at a time when domestic life and family commitments informed much of his daily reality. Periods of chopping wood, fixing a screen door, wandering in the woods, walking a daughter to a school bus, everyday chores and quiet evenings replaced late-night shows and wild touring. The home life seemed to reshape Dylan's identity. Where once his public image had been tightly tied to musical revolution, protest songs, and ceaseless movement, the mid-1960s to early 1970s years show a man seeking stability and groundedness. This transformation was due in no small part to Sara's presence. As the family matured, Dylan and Sara's life remained largely shielded from tabloid glamour. According to biographical accounts, the Woodstock home became a sanctuary. Friends and collaborators from the time recall that Dylan rarely discussed his personal life publicly. Instead, he found solace in domestic routines. The existence of children, the workload of parenting, school runs, and home life seemed to root him in something more concrete than the cloud of celebrity. This domesticated phase, the marriage, children, and home in Woodstock, had a stabilizing effect on Dylan's personal life and creative output. Albums released in the years following the marriage included songs that some interpret as reflecting the emotional complexity of family life. Though critics often point to other factors, industry pressure, creative evolution, artistic restlessness, many biographers maintain that Sara's influence was pivotal in softening the edge of Dylan's earlier turmoil, giving him a base, a home, a sense of normalcy that, until then, had eluded him. Yet even as Dylan appeared more settled, his personal and professional pressures were far from over. In 1966, following the end of a major world tour, Dylan was involved in a motorcycle accident. The domestic shelter provided by Sara and the family home in Woodstock helped him during recovery and allowed him to regroup. By 1973, after years rooted in upstate New York, Dylan and his family sold their Woodstock house and relocated to a modest property on the Point Dume Peninsula, near Malibu, California. The move reflected another turning point in their lives, a shift perhaps towards new environments, but also indicative of a restlessness beneath the surface. Despite the outward appearance of domestic calm, the foundations of the marriage began to strain, particularly as Dylan embarked on art classes in New York City. According to Dylan himself, those classes marked the beginning of marital breakdown. "My wife never did understand me ever since that day," he reportedly said. Nevertheless, the years of marriage and family, from 1965 until their eventual separation in 1977, represent a distinct chapter in Dylan's life. The song Sara as the central confession. When Bob Dylan recorded Sara during the Desire sessions in 1975, he was entering a period defined by public reinvention and private turmoil. The song was recorded on July 31, 1975, at Columbia Recording Studios' Studio E in New York City, one of the final nights of the extensive and sometimes chaotic sessions that produced Desire. Contemporary studio logs, musician testimonies, and biographical accounts agree on one unusual and well-documented detail. Sara Lownds, Dylan's wife since November 22, 1965, was physically present in the studio during the recording of the song. This was not a common occurrence for Dylan, whose working method tended to be private, even secretive. But her presence that night coincided with one of the rawest autobiographical performances of his career. Sara was written during the period surrounding the breakdown of their marriage. Dylan and Sara had separated earlier in the 1970s, reconciled briefly, and were again in a severe marital crisis by 1975. The couple's divorce would be filed in March 1977 and finalized later that year in New York State. Desire, released on January 5, 1976, became one of the best-selling albums of his career, reaching #1 on the Billboard 200 chart. Sara, the closing track of the album, quickly drew attention from critics and listeners for its unusually explicit autobiographical content. The lyrics of Sara contain numerous verifiable biographical references. When Dylan sings about staying up for days in the Chelsea hotel, writing "sad-eyed lady of the lowlands" for you, he is invoking a specific moment in 1965 or 1966. "Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands" was recorded on February 16, 1966, at the Columbia studio A Sessions for Blonde on Blonde. The Chelsea Hotel, specifically the Hotel Chelsea on 222 West 23rd Street in Manhattan, was indeed where Dylan spent extended periods in the mid-1960s, and where sections of the Blonde on Blonde material were written. The family details in Sara are also rooted in verifiable chronology. Dylan adopted Sara's daughter, Maria Lownds, after their marriage in 1965. Maria was born in October 1961. The couple then had 4 children together. When the song references scenes of a baby daughter, it reflects a period in the late 1960s when Dylan was living in Woodstock, New York, with Sara and their children. By 1968 and 1969, the family was firmly established at their home on Camelot Road in the Birdcliff colony near Woodstock, an area that became central to Dylan's life after his July 29, 1966, motorcycle accident near his home in Birdcliff. The references to their wedding are equally grounded in documented fact. Dylan and Sara were married on November 22, 1965, in a private ceremony at a judge's office on Long Island, New York. Their wedding was not publicly known until years later, and only a small number of friends and relatives were present. When the song invokes memories of the early years of their relationship, it aligns with events documented in multiple biographies, including those by Anthony Scaduto, Clinton Halen, and Sounez. The recording circumstances of Sara are also well preserved in the accounts of musicians present at the Desire sessions. Violinist Scarlett Rivera, percussionist Emmylou Harris, who sang on several tracks from the album, and producer Don DeVito all commented later on the emotional tenor of that night. Rivera and others noted that Dylan performed the song directly facing Sara, who was seated in the control room. DeVito, in interviews, described the session as unusually intense, one of the most emotionally charged moments of the project. Sara is also notable for its structure and tone relative to Dylan's other autobiographical writing, whereas Blood on the Tracks, recorded in September to December 1974 and released on January 17, 1975, contains songs widely interpreted as reflecting marital strife. It remains lyrically oblique. Dylan himself famously denied that Blood on the Tracks was autobiographical, claiming it was based on Anton Chekhov's short stories, although many close to him disagreed. By contrast, Sara includes explicit references to identifiable events, locations, and family experiences. For that reason, scholars such as Michael Gray and Clinton Halen regard Sara as one of the very few Dylan compositions that is straightforwardly autobiographical without metaphorical disguise. Critical reception at the time of the album's release emphasized the song's unusual openness. Rolling Stone's original 1976 review by Dave Marsh noted that Sara was unlike anything Dylan had written before, describing it as astonishingly direct. The broader critical consensus has continued to treat the song as a central document for understanding Dylan's emotional life during the mid-1970s. Later reassessments, including those published in the New York Times, Mojo, and Uncut, often refer to Sara as a public attempt at reconciliation during a failing marriage. The context of Dylan's artistic activities in 1975 further amplifies the significance of the song. That year, he launched the Rolling Thunder Revue, a tour that began in October 1975 and continued into 1976, characterized by intimate venues and a theatrical, communal stage atmosphere. Sara accompanied Dylan for parts of the Rolling Thunder period, appearing briefly in his 1978 film Rinaldo and Clara, which contains footage from the tour and includes scenes referencing their relationship. The film, though critically divisive, documents Dylan's personal and artistic environment during the time Sara was written and performed. The inclusion of Sara in the project reflects her ongoing presence in his creative life, even as their marriage deteriorated. Biographers' consensus and the legacy of their relationship. From the earliest major biographies of Bob Dylan, including works by the likes of Clinton Heylin and Howard Soons, Sara Lownds was a central, defining figure in Dylan's personal life, frequently described as the woman who shaped the trajectory from his frenetic early years into a more settled family existence. In Heylin's extensive chronicle of Dylan's life, Sara is portrayed not as a fleeting muse, but as a stabilizing, grounding presence whose influence reverberated through Dylan's domestic choices, creative pauses, and eventual re-emergence as a different kind of artist. Similarly, Soons, in his scholarly biography, chronicles how the marriage in 1965, the adoption of Sara's daughter Maria, and the birth of their subsequent children marked a distinct transformation in Dylan's identity and lifestyle, away from the nomadic troubadour image toward that of a father, husband, and quieter man. Critical surveys of Dylan's career often draw a line between the pre-Sara era and the Sara years, treating the latter as a coherent chapter that deserves its own classification. Music historians argue that the shift wasn't simply cosmetic, but structural. Those years, rooted in domesticity, reshaped Dylan's creative impulses and personal priorities. Many commentators consider the period from about 1966 through the early 1970s as one of redefinition, Dylan ceasing to be merely the restless young folk or rock poet, and instead evolving into a multi-dimensional artist whose experiences of fatherhood, family, and domestic loss would later infuse his work with a deeper emotional resonance. Among critics and journalists who have engaged in long-form writing on Dylan's life, the narrative around Sara frequently functions as shorthand for romantic gravity. Authors referencing that period often speak of the Sara anchor, the idea that she provided a kind of tethering force for Dylan's drifting life. The imagery is not hyperbolic in those accounts. Writers point to documented facts. Dylan's retreat to a house near the Birdcliff colony in Woodstock after his 1966 motorcycle accident, 1966, his near disappearance from the touring circuit, his choice to raise children in a secluded environment rather than follow the conventional rock star lifestyle, and the blending of a family with 4 children and an adopted child. All of these are described not just as chronological happenstance, but as deliberate life decisions. Decisions biographers say would not have happened without Sara's influence. When the couple separated and ultimately divorced in 1977, biographers and analysts view it as a tragic turning point. Some critics describe the divorce as a wound that never fully healed, not just for Sara or their children, but for Dylan himself. Subsequent songs, interviews, and artistic phases are often read in light of that loss, as attempts to grapple with what was once a stable domestic life, but then disintegrated. In retrospective essays and documentary treatments of Dylan's life, writers refer to Sara as the great love, the central partner, or the woman who anchored his family life. These characterizations are often backed by concrete data: the 12 years they spent together between marriage and divorce, the 5 children they raised, the home in Woodstock that served as family sanctuary, Dylan's retreat from public life for months or even years at a time, and the emotionally raw, autobiographical nature of his songwriting during and after that period. Moreover, scholars point out that few of Dylan's relationships, romantic or otherwise, have produced such a clear, traceable impact on both his personal decisions and his creative output. With previous relationships, documentation is often fragmentary, or the timelines are unclear. With Sara, by contrast, timelines align fairly tightly. Interestingly, beyond the personal, Sara's role also influenced how Dylan navigated fame, public expectation, and his own artistic evolution. According to biographical accounts, when Dylan moved his family to Woodstock and largely withdrew from public touring after 1966, it wasn't purely due to the motorcycle accident. It was also a choice to adopt a slower, more private mode of living suitable for children. This move resulted in decreased media exposure, fewer high-profile concerts, and more intimate creative gatherings, such as the informal sessions with the band that became known as the Basement Tapes. Many critics argue that this domestic interlude, made possible by Sara's influence and presence, allowed Dylan to regroup, reimagine his art, and eventually re-emerge with a broader, more mature perspective. In academic and journalistic retrospectives published decades later, Sara is sometimes presented not just as a life partner, but as a symbolic figure, the personification of home, groundedness, and the private life behind the myth of Dylan. Documentaries, in particular, often contrast the frantic early touring years with the calm, wooded scenes of Woodstock family life, using photographs of Dylan with Sara and their children, scenes of a modest house in the woods, and quiet domestic routines. Sara was thus the anchor that held everything together. Decline, divorce, and the enduring mythos of Sara. By the mid-1970s, a combination of emotional distance, infidelity, and mounting domestic pressure eventually made Dylan and Sara's marriage untenable. Their divorce was finalized in 1977 in New York State, ending what had been a 12-year marriage that began with a private wedding on November 22, 1965. Publicly, Dylan rarely spoke in detail about the causes of their marital breakdown, but in his 1978 film project, Ronaldo and Clara, which documented parts of his 1975 to 1976 Rolling Thunder Revue tour, glimpses of personal turmoil can be inferred. Journalistic and biographical sources from the late 1970s onward report that Dylan pursued romantic relationships outside his marriage. Friends and associates mention emotional distance between Dylan and Sara, intensifying after the Rolling Thunder period, and that Sara increasingly withdrew from public appearances and musical circles. Though infidelity is frequently referenced in retrospective biographies as one of the stressors, no definitive public verification has ever been released. Still, multiple memoirs of acquaintances from that time refer to affairs, repeated absences, and a breakdown in trust. By 1976, the couple's domestic life had deteriorated substantially. Their home on the Point Dume Peninsula in Malibu, California, purchased around that time after the family sold their Woodstock property, became, according to some sources, a fraught environment for the children. Reports from relatives and long-term confidants suggest that Sara increasingly took on the role of primary caregiver, while Dylan, absorbed in art classes, recording sessions, and touring arrangements, was often physically or emotionally distant. One biographer notes that Dylan told friends that his decision to enroll in art classes in New York City in 1975 marked the beginning of a deeper estrangement. "My wife never did understand me ever since that day," he said. In March 1977, Sara filed for divorce. Legal documents from the New York courts record the dissolution of their marriage, including arrangements for child custody and division of property. Given that some of their children were minors, and the adopted daughter Maria was a teenager, the divorce records included terms for support and visitation. After the divorce was finalized, Dylan and Sara parted ways. The children remained under arrangements set by the courts, and Sara largely receded from the public eye, avoiding involvement in Dylan's subsequent musical or public ventures. Yet despite the formal end of their marriage, Sara Lownds did not vanish from Dylan's personal mythology. In fact, she loomed larger than ever, not as a spouse, but as an enduring presence, symbol, and emotional anchor in the story of Dylan's life. Among those who knew him personally from that time, there are accounts of Dylan entering long periods of introspection, avoiding public discussion of his private life, and channeling pain and regret into art. Some of the songs recorded in the late 1970s and early 1980s are often interpreted by scholars as reflections on loss, memory, and the consequences of domestic collapse. For many fans, the finality of the divorce, combined with the emotional rawness of Sara, gives the sense that what was lost was more than a marriage. It was a deeply felt home, a creative sanctuary, a period of grounding that framed much of Dylan's external and internal identity. After the dissolution of his marriage to Sara Lownds in 1977, Bob Dylan's public and creative life continued in full force, even as details of his private life became increasingly discreet. Over the following decades, he added to his already vast legacy of songwriting, recording, and performance, maintaining his position as one of the most influential and prolific singer-songwriters of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the years immediately following the divorce, Dylan did not retreat from music. Instead, his output diversified. Through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s and 2010s, he released a steady stream of albums, experimented with different musical styles, and toured periodically. His body of work expanded to include not just folk and protest songs, but rock, blues, gospel, and Americana, showcasing his versatility and willingness to evolve. His influence also manifested in formal recognition. Over decades, Dylan earned some of the highest honors available to musicians and songwriters. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016 for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. He has also received multiple Grammy Awards across various decades. Through continual reinvention and prolific creativity, Dylan maintained his place as a central figure in modern music history long after the turbulence of the 1960s and 70s. On the personal side, Dylan remarried briefly. He was married to singer Carolyn Dennis from 1986 to 1992, and together they had a child, daughter Desiree Gabrielle Dennis Dylan, born in 1986. Beyond this marriage, Dylan did not publicly enter into another long-term or legally recognized union. While he fathered children and occasionally was linked to companions, none of these relationships led to marriage. Because Dylan withdrew much of his private life from public exposure, details about romantic relationships, domestic arrangements, and family life after his second marriage remain sparse and often speculative. Unlike the 1965 to 1977 period, when his marriage, children, domestic life, and songs were closely intertwined, his later years have been defined by discretion. This privacy may have been a conscious choice. After decades under intense public scrutiny, maintaining personal boundaries afforded Dylan the space to continue creating without the constant glare. Despite the quiet personal life he maintained, Dylan remained very much in the public eye professionally. He continued to tour intermittently, release albums, and collaborate with other artists. His writing, both lyrics and spoken reflections, retained a lyrical depth and narrative power that had long defined his work. Through shifting musical landscapes, changing cultural contexts, and evolving audience tastes, Dylan adapted. He refused to be pigeonholed, resisting the nostalgia-only circuit. Instead, he pushed forward, releasing new material, reinterpreting his own classics in concerts, and staying artistically active, well into advanced age. That combination of sustained creativity and private discretion helped shape a kind of legend around him. For many fans and commentators, the enduring intensity of his first marriage to Sara Lownds, combined with the comparatively brief and private nature of his second marriage, reinforces the emotional weight of that initial relationship. Sara remains, for them, the defining romantic figure of his life. Dylan continued building an extraordinary artistic legacy, experimenting, evolving, receiving accolades, and influencing generations of musicians, while keeping his personal life largely out of the spotlight. Throughout it all, Sara Lownds remains the one true love of his life, an irreplaceable chapter. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.